Mr Speaker.
Member for Whitsunday.
Thank you. I contribute to what is the most significant change to public policy, the perspective of life and death as viewed by Queenslanders, the way in which the state protects life and upholds the obligations and community expectations. This legislation will impact everyday Queenslanders, not limited to the individuals seeking out volunteer-assisted suicide, however also medical practitioners, institutions, individuals and families that make up our communities. My role as a parliamentarian and a legislator is to review the legislation, and traditionally on majority of decisions it's also to review it alongside my colleagues within the context of our party, its values and our policy position. It is also our responsibility as elected members to represent the views of our electorates and the communities in which we represent. And I thank my constituents for sharing their very personalised stories and views from both sides of the debate. Having been granted a conscience vote, it is both a privilege and freedom that I recognise and thank our leadership team for. And on such matters of life and death, what is so very personal for both, for many, at times emotive and goes to the heart of your values, your beliefs, your life experience and worldview. And for me, on this topic, it also defines humanity. The way in which society treats our most vulnerable, our sick, our elderly, our marginalised, and today we debate this legislation for those who are terminally ill. While I respect an individual's right to choose, and as part of that right as a society, we have seen a shift in the autonomy of health decisions, this has been a trend in Western culture that I recognise is both the overwhelming perception and at times the reality of popularity that a large majority of our Queensland population supports the intent of voluntary assisted dying. Through the many discussions that I have had, it is through the lived experience of losing a loved one, a friend, a colleague, or witnessing the pain, as many have outlined in this House before me, of a good death or a bad death. It is not my role to pass judgment on any member of this House, nor Queenslander who has a view on voluntary assisted dying. I will respect the views of my colleagues, whether differing or not, and recognise the deeply personal and respectful way in which a decision of conscience is to be made. As it is the individual freedom that is a core value of our party and that of my own. Respect for life is a fundamental societal value, and know that every member in this House over the course of this debate has expressed their individual view within their conscience. Whilst I was raised a Catholic with Christian values, the respect for life and values and beliefs that shape me form my conscience. In my view, the traditional concept of respect for life surpasses an individual's religious view and, for me, is the foundation for humanity. Lived experience and lifelong learning from diverse cultures. It is often assumed that this is exclusive to faith-based organisations or Christians, but this is not the case for me. Within our society, in our community, we hold in regard many institutions that exist in health, faith and community. In regards to this bill, many have expressed concerns both against and in support of this legislation. And later in the debate, the member for Toowoomba South will move many who have expressed the needs for amendments. I raised concerns about the education of the broader community of this legislation, the unintended consequences, the safeguards and protections outlined in the legislation. However, in my consideration of this bill, I share many of the concerns, both real and unintended, that impact on the safeguards and protections of Queenslanders. I note that many submissions by Palliative Care Queensland, the Queensland Care Alliance, faith-based institutions and the AMA, and the concerns that they have outlined both during committee process and during the course of this legislation being introduced, and they should be recognised and valued. I also recognise the very deeply personal submissions made by individuals who strongly support this legislation. What has also been concerning is the number of constituents who have contacted me in support of the legislation who assume that dementia and Alzheimer's and other terminal illnesses that aren't included are in fact are not included when the perception is that they are, and there must be more education delivered. Whilst the bill outlines the access to VAD if you're an individual with a terminal illness expected to die within 12 months and be suffering intolerable pain, I find this time frame a conflict with the access to palliative care options, which is limited across the state to 3 months. I've heard many say that this bill is separate from palliative care. I recognise the Law Reform Commission, having prepared the recommendations based on a legal framework to facilitate individuals who may be suffering and dying, who choose suicide, and the timing of their death. But I speak with both conscience and the shared awareness among stakeholders that this bill's objective is dangerous in isolation, that a lack of access and option for alternatives to end-of-life care, quality and specialised palliative care can have the unintended consequences of individuals choosing to end life through voluntary assisted suicide, and in fact we know that suicides are already occurring at a significantly high rate for the terminally ill. And it begs the question how many of those people have access to quality palliative care. I've had it communicated by many in the medical profession that if a properly funded palliative care service was available with specialist and holistic standards of care, we would not be here debating this bill today. Fundamental principles of life and the default position of prolonging life or the preservation of human life underpins many who serve in the medical profession, those that serve in faith-based organisations and many community organisations and also cultural leaders. For many, it is the underpinning of their view of humanity. Regional and rural remote communities already experience inequity when it comes to accessing healthcare. We already have limited access for diagnosis, with majority of specialists residing in metropolitan South East Queensland. The VAD and this essential debate is one of individual choice. But when there is an absence of palliative care, I refer to the member for Gregory and the member for Traeger's comments. My fear is that many across rural and regional Queensland will see this legislation, if passed, as the only option. Our access and service standard is inequitable to our city counterparts, and this needs to be addressed. In my electorate of Whitsunday, there is no specific palliative care service. We do have what is wonderful staff at our local Proserpine Hospital and GPs who, with little resourcing, provide a standard of care and support for individuals and families that, whilst is not specialised, provides a palliative care pathway. And I was very humbled to be able to experience that alongside my grandfather in his last days. They do their best to support dignity with appropriate medical care and where a GP is doing the best they can. But they are not a pain specialist. They are not a palliative care specialist. In my neighbouring electorate, of which a third of my electorate resides in Mackay, the Mackay Hospital Service does not have palliative care beds. In fact, it is the Mater Hospital that supports with 9 palliative care beds. In my community, I ask the question of this legislation: what are the rights of the Mater Hospital, of the doctors, nurses and administrators who will work there, with respect to their conscientious objection, and when they are the only private palliative care provider in my region? I note the Minister introduced the clinical guidelines and a commitment of consultation with faith-based organisations. On such important legislation, I find this unacceptable, that new models of care, the resourcing and implementation is outlined on a page with 6 dot points. This provides no confidence to institutions and practitioners, and more broadly the general public, whose care will be determined by these guidelines. Healthcare facilities where there is a distinctive mission or where there is an individual within that service that wants to exercise their right of conscience should be valued and respected and protected under the same premise of freedom that this bill offers those accessing VAD. I'm concerned about the vulnerable, the elderly and those with a disability, and as someone who is responsible for a family member with an intellectual disability, I can already see the risk associated with that and this legislation. I want to place on the record my advocacy for the Palliative Care Queensland submission and the recommendations regarding funding and access to care. I want to acknowledge and thank the work of the committee, all of its members and the Secretariat, as what would have been an emotionally draining and very hard task to undertake. We have reflected on death. All experiences are not equal. It should be the right of every individual to experience a death free from pain and suffering, with dignity, care and respect. And as we reflect on living, not all experiences and opportunities are equal. The core values that underpin my morality and social ethics include hope. And while life is full of grey and full of complexity, while it may seem a simple statement, for me, for my conscience, life is life. It is not for our choosing, nor the state, to take it away. I will not be supporting this legislation.
Speaker. Member for Bundaberg.